The photographs don't lie. Buildings across Saint Petersburg, Boston, Chicago, and dozens of other cities show the same architectural anomaly. Windows that should open onto streets instead face packed earth. Doorways that once welcomed visitors now lead directly into soil. Ornate archways, perfectly symmetrical, buried halfway up their frames. The explanation we're given is simple: urban development, street levels raised over time, natural settling, cultural layers of debris accumulating across decades. But when you examine the scale, the geographic distribution, the sheer consistency of these features across continents, that explanation begins to feel insufficient. Not wrong, necessarily, just incomplete, because something happened, something that left physical evidence we can still measure, photograph, and document. The question isn't whether these buried levels exist. They demonstrably do. The question is what sequence of events could produce this pattern simultaneously across the industrialized world during a remarkably narrow window of time. Between approximately 1811 and 1862, something changed. The photographic record begins just after this period, and what it shows raises questions about the world that preceded it. Empty streets in brand new cities, elaborate buildings standing in landscapes that appear freshly excavated, infrastructure that suggests coordination on a scale our historical narrative struggles to account for. This isn't about proving a civilization called Tartaria existed or didn't exist. This is about examining what the physical evidence actually shows us, and asking whether our current understanding explains all of it, or whether there are gaps, absences, pieces missing from a story we've been told so many times we've stopped questioning. Whether it's complete, the buildings remain, the photographs persist, the buried windows still face nothing but earth, and beneath our streets, infrastructure still functions that was supposedly built by men with hand tools and horse-drawn wagons. Let's examine what's actually there. The architecture that shouldn't exist. Walk through any major city built before 1900, and you'll notice something peculiar about the oldest structures. Not just that they're old, but that they're buried. In Chicago, entire first floors sit below current street level. In Boston, archways that once stood 12 feet tall now barely clear 6 feet above the sidewalk. In European cities from London to Moscow, basement windows identical in design to upper floor windows suggest these spaces were never meant to be underground. The standard explanation involves gradual urban infill. Cities raised their street levels over time to improve drainage, reduce flooding, and create space for sewers. Chicago's deliberate street raising in the 1850s and 1860s is well documented. Between 1855 and 1865, the city physically lifted thousands of buildings using jack screws, some weighing over 27,000 tons, raising them as much as 6 feet to install new infrastructure beneath. But here's what doesn't align. The buildings that were raised in Chicago were raised because the streets around them were being raised first. The question becomes, why did the streets need to be raised? Official records cite flooding and drainage issues. Chicago sat at nearly the same elevation as Lake Michigan, making sewage systems impossible without elevation. Yet photographs from the period show something curious. The buildings being raised weren't primitive wooden structures. They were multi-story masonry buildings with ornate facades, iron frameworks, and architectural sophistication that required significant engineering expertise. The Tremont House Hotel, raised 6 feet in 1861, had 6 stories and continued operating during the entire lifting process, with guests checking in and out while the building ascended. The engineering required for this operation surpasses many modern construction projects. This raises a question: if these structures could be built with such precision initially, why were they built at a flood-prone elevation in the first place? The engineering sophistication required to raise a 6-story occupied hotel without cracking its masonry suggests the builders possessed advanced knowledge of structural engineering, yet they supposedly didn't foresee the need for proper drainage when originally constructing at that elevation. The same pattern appears in cities worldwide during the same period. Buildings with buried first floors, windows facing earth, architectural features suggesting original ground levels significantly lower than current street grades. And this isn't isolated to a few structures. It's systematic, affecting entire city blocks across multiple continents. Saint Petersburg shows buildings with elaborate archways now halfway underground. Boston has entire neighborhoods where original entrances sit below modern sidewalks. San Francisco, despite being rebuilt after the 1906 earthquake, has pre-quake photographs showing structures already partially buried. European cities display the same features, often with no official record of deliberate street raising. The explanation of gradual accumulation feels insufficient when you look at the timeline. Most of these cities show this burial within photographs spanning just 50 to 70 years, roughly 1850 to 1920. For cultural layers to accumulate enough to bury first-floor windows requires either extraordinarily rapid accumulation or an event that deposited significant material in a compressed time frame. The infrastructure paradox. The official narrative places the 1800s as a period of primitive infrastructure gradually evolving toward industrialization, horse-drawn transportation, letter-based communication, hand-tool construction. Yet the physical infrastructure that remains tells a different story. By 1840, the United States had constructed over 3,000 miles of canals. These weren't simple ditches. They were precisely engineered waterways with complex lock systems to navigate elevation changes. The Erie Canal, completed in 1825, stretched 363 miles from the Hudson River to Lake Erie, featuring 83 locks and overcoming a 571-foot elevation difference. The engineering required to survey, grade, and construct this canal system supposedly relied on basic tools and animal power. But consider the precision involved. Each lock had to be exactly calibrated. Water flow had to be precisely managed. Elevation calculations had to account for seasonal variations. The canal walls had to be perfectly graded to prevent erosion and maintain consistent water depth across hundreds of miles. And this was just one canal. By the Civil War start in 1861, canal systems crisscrossed the eastern United States, all built within a 40-year period. Simultaneously, railroad construction expanded dramatically. By 1860, over 30,000 miles of railroad track had been laid. Not simple wooden rails, but iron rails supported by graded roadbeds, bridging systems, and tunnel excavations. The first transcontinental railroad, completed in 1869, crossed 1,912 miles of varying terrain, including the Sierra Nevada mountains. The engineering challenges included calculating grades through mountain passes, excavating tunnels through solid granite, and building bridges across canyons, all supposedly accomplished with hand tools, black powder, and manual labor. The timeline creates cognitive dissonance. Canal construction peaked between 1815 and 1840. Railroad construction exploded between 1840 and 1860. Both required massive earth moving, precise surveying, advanced engineering knowledge, and coordination across vast distances. Yet photographs from this period show cities that appear freshly excavated, as if the infrastructure was being uncovered rather than constructed. Contemporary accounts describe the infrastructure projects, but there's a peculiar absence of detailed construction methodology in many cases. We have extensive financial records. We know who funded the projects. We can trace ownership and political maneuvering. But the actual construction techniques, the tools used, the workforce organization, often remains vaguely described as manual labor or immigrant workers with picks and shovels. The World's Fair question between 1893 and 1915. Major cities across the world hosted elaborate World's Fairs, also called expositions. Chicago in 1893, Paris in 1889, Buffalo in 1901, St. Louis in 1904, San Francisco in 1915. Each fair featured enormous temporary structures, built in remarkably short time frames. The 1893 Chicago World's Fair, known as the World's Columbian Exposition, constructed over 100 buildings covering 600 acres in less than 2 years. The structures weren't simple wooden sheds. They featured classical architecture rivaling European cathedrals, massive domes, elaborate sculptures, perfectly proportioned colonnades. The administration building's dome stood 275 feet high, covered in gold leaf, with architectural details requiring months of skilled craftsmanship, all built with horses, hand tools, and manual labor, according to official records, and all demolished immediately after the fairs ended, despite their apparent durability and beauty. The 1893 fair buildings were torn down within months of closing, despite public outcry to preserve them. The 1915 San Francisco Fair incurred demolition costs exceeding $461,000, equivalent to over $10 million today, to completely remove all structures and restore the land. Why the urgent destruction? The official explanation cites the buildings' temporary nature. They were made from staff, a plaster mixture with jute fibers and horsehair, molded over wooden frames. Beautiful, but not permanent. Yet photographs show structures that appear substantially built, with stone-like facades and architectural detailing that would take modern craftsmen months to reproduce. Contemporary observers questioned whether the buildings were truly temporary when workers began demolishing the Chicago Fair. Witnesses reported the structures appeared far more solid than plaster and wood. Some accounts describe materials that seemed more substantial, construction that appeared designed for permanency, and the pattern repeats across multiple fairs. Massive construction in impossibly short time frames. Immediate demolition upon closing, often by dynamite, as if to ensure complete removal. The 1904 St. Louis Fair was dynamited the day it closed. The effort to destroy sometimes exceeded the effort to preserve. Meanwhile, the single structure preserved from the Chicago Fair, the Palace of Fine Arts, still stands today as the Museum of Science and Industry. It was constructed of brick and covered in plaster, specifically designed to last, which raises the question, if they could build permanent structures in 1893, why were all the others designed as temporary, unless they weren't designed at all, unless they were repurposed, unless the fairs served a different function than we've been told? The timeline compression. Look at the dates again. Canal construction peaks between 1815 and 1840. Railroad expansion explodes between 1830 and 1860. Major urban development and street raising occurs between 1850 and 1880. Photographs begin appearing in the 1850s, showing cities that already appear established, with infrastructure that already exists. Yet this is supposedly the same period when Americans used outhouses, traveled by horse, and built with basic tools. The same decades when most homes lacked running water, electric light didn't exist, and cross-country travel took months. The technological timeline doesn't compress comfortably. We're told industrialization was gradual, starting with simple machines and slowly advancing to complex systems. But the infrastructure already in place by 1850 suggests coordination and engineering capability that shouldn't exist for another 50 to 100 years. Consider the 1811 to 1812 New Madrid earthquakes, among the most powerful in North American history. They caused massive soil liquefaction across the central United States, temporarily reversing the Mississippi River's flow and creating new land formations. Contemporary accounts describe ground levels shifting dramatically, buildings sinking, and terrain fundamentally altered. Then, within 40 years, massive canal systems cross these same regions. Railroads traverse the restructured landscape. Cities emerge in areas that were recently seismically devastated, all supposedly built from scratch by settlers with basic tools. The Great Flood of 1862 in California inundated large areas for months, depositing massive amounts of sediment. San Francisco photographs from the 1860s show buildings already displaying buried first floors. Yet the city was less than 20 years old at that point, founded during the 1849 gold rush. How does a city barely 2 decades old already have buildings with buried architectural features, unless those buildings preceded the city's official founding date, or unless a significant deposition event occurred that buried existing structures? The photographic record-yearly photography provides our most direct evidence. Daguerreotypes from the 1840s, 1850s wet plate collodion prints from the 1850s-1870s. These weren't artistic renderings subject to interpretation. They were chemical records of physical reality, and what they show is peculiar. Cities that appear empty, elaborate buildings standing in seemingly undeveloped surroundings, street scenes with few people despite supposedly thriving populations, infrastructure that appears aged, weathered, as if already old when photographed. The standard explanation involves long exposure times. Early photographs required subjects to remain motionless for 30 seconds to several minutes, making moving people and vehicles appear as ghostly blurs or vanish entirely. This explains the empty streets, but it doesn't explain the architectural condition. Buildings photographed in the 1860s often show weathering, settling, and material degradation, suggesting decades of existence. Yet according to construction records, many were supposedly built just years before being photographed. The 1871 Chicago fire provides an interesting case study. The fire destroyed a large portion of the city, and rebuilding began immediately. Photographs from the early 1870s show the rebuilt areas, but they also show the undamaged areas, and those display the same buried first-floor phenomenon, the same architectural aging, the same infrastructure sophistication as cities twice as old. Photographs from post-fair Chicago, after the 1893 exposition, show the demolished fairgrounds. The land appears excavated, as if structures were removed, not just demolished. The terrain looks disturbed, reworked, rather than simply cleared. What we know, what we don't, or what the physical evidence shows us without speculation. Buildings across multiple continents show buried first floors, architectural features below current ground level, and design elements suggesting different original street grades. This is documented, measurable, photographable. Major infrastructure projects, canals, railroads, urban development occurred in compressed timeframes during the mid-1800s, requiring engineering sophistication that seems advanced for the reported technology of the period. This is historically recorded. World's fairs featured elaborate temporary structures built rapidly and demolished completely, often at significant expense. This is documented in contemporary accounts and financial records. Photographs from the mid to late 1800s show cities and infrastructure that appear more established than the official timelines suggest. This is preserved in historical photographic archives. Major geological events, earthquakes, floods, seismic activity occurred during this same period, particularly between 1811 to 1862. This is scientifically documented. Here's what we don't know. Why street levels rose so consistently across geographically diverse cities within such a narrow time frame. Why infrastructure projects requiring advanced engineering were completed so rapidly with supposedly primitive technology. Why World's Fair structures were demolished so urgently and completely rather than repurposed. Why photographs show architectural aging and infrastructure maturity that seems inconsistent with official construction dates. What sequence of events could produce such widespread buried architecture across multiple continents within the same approximate period? The question that remains: the official historical narrative isn't necessarily wrong, it's potentially incomplete. The evidence suggests something happened during the mid-1800s that affected urban development, infrastructure, and architecture on a scale larger than localized urban planning decisions. Was it a series of natural events, widespread flooding, seismic activity, and geological shifts that forced rapid infrastructure adaptation? Possibly. The documented earthquakes and floods support this. Was it technological? Did engineering knowledge exist that hasn't been properly credited in historical records? Perhaps. The infrastructure sophistication suggests advanced capability. It's something else entirely. An event or sequence of events that disrupted civilization enough to require rebuilding, but not enough to completely destroy it. That becomes speculative, but the physical evidence makes the question legitimate. What we can say with certainty is this: the physical remains don't entirely match the story we've been told. The buried windows still face Earth, the infrastructure still functions, the photographs still show what they show, and the timeline still compresses uncomfortably. History is written by those who survive to write it, but architecture is written by those who build it. And sometimes what's built tells a different story than what's written. The buildings are still there. The evidence hasn't vanished. We just have to be willing to look at it and admit when our explanations feel incomplete. Because maybe the story we've been told isn't wrong. Maybe it's just missing a chapter about what happened before the photographs began, before the official records start, before the narrative solidified into accepted fact. The Mudflood Theory proposes one explanation. The official narrative proposes another. But perhaps the real question isn't which explanation is correct. Perhaps it's what additional evidence would help us understand what actually happened during those decades when the world changed. Streets rose, and entire levels of civilization were buried beneath our feet. The windows still face Earth. The question is, why?